third year, I think it made about $20 million, that business did, in profit. And my brother was like a 80-something% owner. And he didn't know what to do with all of the profit. And he came to me one day in 2012 and he was like, I'm going to buy $1 million of Bitcoin. And so we talked about it. And then in the end, he didn't do it. You come up with a theory about something that the market wants. And then you run micro experiments to see if you're right. And when you're right and you have product market fit, you scale into that. My life has actually been me being tantalizingly close to massive success probably 25 times.
Mike, great to have you on the show.
Yeah, great to be with you. Excited to do this.
So you've had a pretty interesting career, and you're currently the founder and owner of a business called Simple Modern. Last reported over 200 million of yearly revenue, which is kind of insane to say out loud. I'm excited to hear a little bit about your background.
It's insane to live it.
Yeah.
It's crazy, man. I've had a very long and winding road. In fact, I do a lot of speaking to college students, and one of the things that I tell them is when you're a college student and you're about to graduate, you're like, oh man, I got to make the right choice out of here. I got to pick the right job, because if I don't, like my career's not going to go the way I want it to. And if you had, as a college student, if I'd been like, oh, okay, here's where I want to be at 45. I want to be running a company that's at a couple $100 million in annual revenue that I started. Okay, what do I need to do right out of college? You would have never picked the career path and the series of steps that I took to get here. So out of college, I was a finance major. Out of college, I, for a number of reasons, took a full-time nonprofit job in the ministry world. I worked with college students. I thought I was going to do it for like a year. It ended up doing it for about 9 years.
How'd you get into that?
So how'd I get? Well, in college, I had my life changed pretty radically, I would say, spiritually. And so was motivated by the idea, but then also I met my wife in college, and she was getting a master's in accounting, where she, a year after we got married, she was still going to be in school. So I knew I was going to be sticking around Norman. I went to the University of Oklahoma, and, I don't know if the listeners know this, but Norman, Oklahoma, and Oklahoma in general, is not known as the financial, capital of the world. So yeah, it wasn't obvious what jobs I would work, and an opportunity came up to work on campus in this kind of ministry position for a year. And I thought, oh, that makes sense. It was almost kind of like a gap year. What I didn't expect is that I loved it. I loved investing my time in other people. And so 1 year turned into 2, which turned into 9. My wife ended up deciding she didn't want to do accounting. She came and worked with me. So we worked together on a team, which was a really great experience. And by the time I got to 30, it was kind of like, well, I guess I'm not going to do the business world thing. And then right around that time, my younger brother approached me with a business idea he had. He'd been pretty successful starting some kind of solopreneur type companies, but he had an idea that would have required really building a team. And I said, hey, this is a really fun nights and weekends thing. Like I'd love to help. What I didn't realize is that would very quickly turn into much more than like a nights and weekends endeavor. We started that company together while I was still full time in the ministry world, and took it 13 months to go from its first sale to its first $1 million of sales in a day. So we had $1 million sales a day 13 months into the company.
Wow.
And I was the oldest person at the company, and I was 30 at the time. So, and I wasn't full time. This was supposed to be like nights and weekends. So that really, I would say, kind of radically reoriented the way that I thought about what I would be doing. We had an idea for another company that if I were to come on full time, we could start. And so I ended up doing that. I ended up transitioning into the business world to be more of an entrepreneur with my brother. We tried that next concept, didn't work actually. So over the next few years, launched several companies that ranged from complete failures to really successful. They were all in kind of the e-commerce space. And then in 2015, a couple of people that I knew really well approached me and just said, hey, if you ever wanted to start something, we would love to do it with you. And so with the two of them, we started Simple Modern, and very atypical founding story. We didn't really know what we wanted to sell. We just knew we wanted it to be in e-commerce. We knew we wanted to kind of bet big on Amazon, and we knew the type of culture and mission that we wanted the company to have. We figured all the other pieces out kind of as we.
I'm always curious how people end up being entrepreneurs. Do you come from a entrepreneurial family, or what was your upbringing like?
Yeah, so my parents are both in mental health. My mom's a social worker. My dad's a psychiatrist, and really the the thing that I took a lot of great stuff from my parents, but there was nothing having to do with business. In some ways, the fact that my brother and I have been so successful as entrepreneurs is kind of random in that sense that you would not have necessarily guessed from our upbringing. And he was always way more entrepreneurial than I was. I would add, and so it's interesting because kind of in my market. I've become a little bit of kind of like the face of entrepreneurship. Like, this is what entrepreneurship looks like. And one of the things I tell students or people when they ask me about it is just that for a long time I did not view myself as an entrepreneur, and it probably wasn't until I was 35 or 36 that I even started to think about myself that way. And so one of the big barriers to being entrepreneurial is, I think, the self-belief that you can do it.
Right.
For a lot of people, and I'm definitely one of those people. So that's actually one of the reasons I love doing podcasts. I love talking about entrepreneurship. Is what I really want to communicate as a message of empowerment, that this is something you can do, and even to take it a step further, that we're very entrepreneurial in the way that we live our lives. We just don't think about it that way. So just as an example here, like dating is a very entrepreneurial thing, right?
Yeah, tell me more about that.
Yeah, so like if you are looking for a significant other or a spouse, you start off with a kind of theory of, here's the type of person I think I would fit well with, that I'd be happy with, that I connect with. And then you see somebody that you think, okay, that person kind of fits it. And you run a micro experiment. And that micro experiment is going on a date. And you're trying to see, like, hey, do I actually have kind of product market fit here? Is that, and sometimes you're like, you know what? I learned from that experience, that date, that series of dates, that actually is not the type of person that I think I'm best suited for. Or sometimes you do, and you're like, wow, like there is something really special here, and you lean into it. And this is really what entrepreneurship is. It's, you look at the market, you come up with a theory about something that the market wants, and then you run micro experiments to see if you're right. And when you're right and you have product market fit, you scale into that. It's basically what it is. And so you do this a lot. It's not just dating. I mean, there's entrepreneurial concepts from everything from what you eat at a restaurant to, how you approach school or anything else. So one of the things that I've really focused on is helping people understand, hey, you do this already, and you know how to do this. You've just never thought about how to map that to the business world. And once you do that, once you help people kind of have the aha moment of, oh, okay, I actually know how to do this. I've just never thought about it that way. I think it creates a much bigger tent of who can be an entrepreneur. And so there are definitely some characteristics, personality traits that help make it easier to be an entrepreneur, like risk tolerance and persistence and a bunch of other stuff. But my general observation is that many more people have the ability to be entrepreneurial than think they do. It's just about helping them to understand how they already have the skills. They just haven't thought about how to apply them in a different context.
I know you teach a entrepreneurship class. I assume a lot of your students are, some of them are red-blooded entrepreneurs, right? Maybe 5% of the class. And then 50% of the class is probably entrepreneurs. Maybe they've read about it, they think they might be, but they'll probably end up with a kind of normal W-2 job or career. How do you connect the dots for those people to teach them, you may have some of these skills, like what is a easy entry towards entrepreneurship?
I think, to go back to the idea, it's entrepreneurship, first of all, starts with curiosity. And I think that this is probably one of the things that most people maybe get wrong from the outside, is that what makes really successful entrepreneurs is that they are curious about how the world works. They're curious about what people want. They're curious about how things work, and teaching people that that's a good thing. Being curious about the world and wanting to learn about how it works is a good thing. And regardless of whether you're quote unquote an entrepreneur that starts a company, or you're just going to be very entrepreneurial in the way that you think about raising your kids, or whatever else. Like, it's a very helpful way of viewing the world, and that there are some people, like you said, they're much more destined to have like a normal W-2 job. But even in that, even in you know regular companies, like, you can be very entrepreneurial and you can create a lot of value and you can be exceptional at your job if you apply entrepreneurial kind of thought processes. So if you're a store clerk at Target, you can be entrepreneurial in the way that you organize yourself and the way that you go about doing things. And I think that that's the principle that I'm trying to teach in general. Like, when there's different ways that you can teach things, the more tactical you get, I think the less helpful and less broadly applicable something is. The more that you can teach people principles and then say, hey, if you learn the principle, then you're going to actually find a way to map this to a bunch of areas of your life. I mentioned this earlier, but I'll double click on it. Um, it's amazing how helpful the entrepreneurial thought process is with my kids. Every kid is different. And what you're really doing is doing a bunch of little micro experiments to figure out how you can help them to learn a concept, to behave the way that they need to behave, to connect with them emotionally, or intellectually, or whatever. And because every child's different, there's no right way. There's no handbook. And so it's really
Can you give me
helpful.
some
And
examples
it's,
of that? What does that look
yeah, for
like?
sure. Like, gosh, like with my son, he's more of an introvert. And I think it would be good for him to be more initiative with people, to make more eye contact with adults when he meets them, this kind of stuff. So it's like, okay, I've got a problem. How do I help him to do that? Because he's not doing it right now. And what I know is that generally it's unhelpful to be like, hey, you should do this. Just do this. Right.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, well, how do I'm going to come up with some different theories about how I could help him to develop that habit and to become better at that. And then I'm going to run little micro tests. And sometimes the micro test doesn't work at all. It's like, well, okay, I tried this. I tried to incentivize the behavior this way. I tried to, I threw him into the pool kind of and put him in this situation to see if he would sink or swim. That didn't work. What if I approached it this different way? And so my son and daughter are very different. So trying to teach them the same concept might look really different and might require a very different approach. This is often what's true in business. And it's one of the reasons why it's difficult. Like, I'm active on social media. And a lot of times on social media, again, it's very tactical. It's like, okay, Elon Musk, here's how he made his money. He did A and then B
Mm-hmm.
and then C and then D. And it's like, well, that's very unlikely to be helpful to you.
Right.
The actual tactics that he used in his career. What is more helpful is the idea of he has these kind of larger aspirations that are a lot more missionary than mercenary, of like, he wants to make humans interplanetary. He wanted to create a world where we were not dependent on fossil fuels. So it's like, I think one thing we can take away from Elon Musk is, okay, this is a guy that's ideologically driven, and that's the reason why he's been able to push all the chips in over and over and over and over again, is because he's ideologically driven. Okay, well, that's a principle that's helpful. That for me to be really successful in areas of life, I need to be much more ideologically driven, kind of intrinsically driven than extrinsically driven. But the tactics aren't as particularly helpful. So, same thing with your kids. It's like, hey, it's funny when you have one kid. Um, it's interesting how humbling your second child is. I guess I would say it that
Tell me
way.
about that.
Well, so like sometimes when my wife and I were pregnant with our second child, I remember saying, we're about to find out if our first child was easy or hard, because we don't know.
Yeah.
Like, all is
Right.
your experience, right? And what we found out is our first child was very easy. And it's easy when you have one child that's an easy child to be like, we're great at parenting, right? Like, they're sleeping through the night, they're doing all this stuff. Our tactics are fantastic.
Right.
Our
I'm the
strategies
best.
are great. Yeah, exactly. And then you have a second, and it's like, I'm doing all the same things, and I'm getting a very different outcome. Like, wait a second, what's going on? And you realize, like, oh, well, some of the reasons that those things worked were very contextual to that particular
Right.
child or their temperament or whatever. And business can be the exact same way. That sometimes you're successful because you're in the right place at the right time, or the
Mm-hmm.
for us with Simple Modern, to use a business example here. Um, listen. We've worked really hard, and I would like to think we have a very gifted, very smart team. But um, we launched into consumer products, and we launched with Amazon first, and we did it at a point where in 2015, where if you look at the revenue chart of Amazon, Amazon's revenue's up, I think 4 or 5x since in the basically 9 years since we did that. So massive macro trend that we launched into. Timing was awesome. And then we launched into a category that would see double digit growth every year for the last 9 years and has just exploded as a category and has been viral on social media, whatever. We could not have foreseen all those things. And those were massive tailwinds. And so, yeah, we've worked really hard. We've been smart. We've approached it right, but also we've been the beneficiary. Like I joke sometimes that 20, 30 years from now, if you tell my story, be like, well, yeah, he launched he launched insulated drinkware on Amazon in 2015. Any idiot could have made that work. So sometimes our success is less due to our brilliance, and it's more due to the situation. And I think that that's part of being effective. Also, is being able to peel apart. Okay, why was I successful? Why was it that things went so easily with my first kid? How much of it was, the approach I took, the strategies I took, and how much of it was just great temperament, or whatever. And so being able to honestly assess yourself is probably one of the most difficult things. Feynman has a great quote. The first rule is you must not fool yourself, and you are the easiest person to fool. So having really
It's great.
good self awareness is difficult because we can't really understand what makes us effective and how we should approach things until we understand. It's basically like our entire life is things happening to us and then us interpreting what happened and why it happened. And one of the more kind of interesting and shocking things about life is that most of the why answers that we come up with are complete guesses.
Mm-hmm.
Now we take them as truth because it's like, okay, that person looked at me interesting. Why did they look at me interesting? Oh, I think it's because I'm wearing, goofy shoes. I shouldn't wear these shoes again. And then we just kind of lock that in there as that's why that happened. And maybe they looked at us funny just because they were thinking about something. They weren't even looking at us.
Right.
They had a funny look on their face. But we don't know that. And so our lives are all these different events where we're kind of interpreting and coming up with why we think things happen. And then we live out of those things as if they're true. So it's the more aware you are and the more effective you are at understanding why things happened, the more effective you are in being able to take lessons from that and live your life differently and more effectively going forward. So it's a hard thing to do.
That's a wonderful insight. And before we get too far, when you started talking about entrepreneurial parenting, I don't know if this is of interest to you, but I immediately imagined a book. For what it's worth, I think there's a good amount of content to write for parents that are like looking for ways to raise kids that are maybe a little bit different, right? Because I think most parenting books that I've kind of perused through are they're specific, right? They're kind of like
Yeah,
giving you ways to parent your kids. And I think the format that you're talking about is a little bit more like push and pull and kind of like react and adapt depending on the needs of the kid.
absolutely. Well, because it's just not one size fits all, and
Yeah.
it's been true in our lives. Like there were just what's helped me to develop, and what my brother needed are different things, different people. I also think there's another thing with parenting, and I'll use this. I'll start with parenting, and then I'll come back to how this applies to entrepreneurship because I think it's very similar. The question is, what is your goal? What are you optimizing for? And are you optimizing for a kid that behaves exactly like you want them to today, or are you optimizing for an adult that's the most resilient or resourceful, or what is it that you're aiming for? And that there's definitely a good amount of material out there with parenting that's like, here's how you get your kid to behave the way you want them to behave today.
Mm,
And interestingly, I think that often helping them to be the adult that we would hope they would be able to be is going to mean that they're going to do a lot of stuff today that we don't, that's more uncomfortable.
right.
And it's interesting because when we think about setting up our kids for success in life, every parent says, I want my kid to have a better life than me. It's just like, that's the dream. No parent's like, I hope they have a worse life than me. And the kind of big question is like, okay, so how do you actually do that? And what the research says, and it's pretty clear, is that the way that you help your children to thrive is that you help them to be resilient, because they're just going to have hard, challenging things in their life. And that building resilience basically requires allowing your children to fail in non-fatal ways. And that is very counterintuitive, because what we would think is, well, my job as a parent is to, protect them from the hard things, protect them from failure. And it's like, I don't think that's actually true at all. Well, we do want to protect them from fatal failure. Like, okay, we don't want them to do that thing that could, lead to them losing a hand or something. But in general, like, failure is good. And we want to put them in situations where they struggle and fail, because working through those is actually going to create the foundation of being able to be, a well-adjusted, successful adult. So in a similar way, one of the things that's hard about getting business advice is it really depends on what are you optimizing for. I'm a pretty terrible person to listen to if your goal is to build a company to the maximum valuation and to sell it in the next
Mm-hmm.
2 or 3 years. Like, you could just tune out now. You don't want to listen to me, because that's not at all what I'm optimizing for and what my goal set is. I think I'm an interesting person to listen to if you are saying, how do I derive the highest quality of life from business and developing a company? I've got lots of thoughts about that. How do I create a company that is trying to create an environment where everybody that interacts with the company comes out as a winner? Yeah, I think I've got interesting ideas on that, but those are different. Those are different goal sets. So being able to have a really clear understanding of what you're trying to aim at and what you're optimizing for makes it much easier to start to think about, hey, what content should I consume? Who should I listen to? That kind of stuff, whether it's parenting or building a company.
You started your entrepreneurial career in a way that I actually like to advise people that aren't as entrepreneurial. For me, I was like, I think I was just born an entrepreneur. I was trying to be a doctor for many years. And then I popped
Yeah,
out of college. I took one entrepreneurship class in college and I just like saw the light and I was like, this is what I'm going to do. I'm totally unemployable. I have to do this thing.
for sure.
And then there's a lot of other people that go and get a job and maybe start a side gig or they start buying real estate on the side. And you had this career, you spent 8 years working a full-time job and then you started this project on the side with your brother and it took off. And oftentimes like that is actually what I recommend to people, right? That don't have the same entrepreneurial kind of just must do that I did. Do you think if that project was not successful, you would not be an entrepreneur? That
That's a
first
great
project
question.
that you did?
It's a great question, because one of the things in retrospect I learned is that I was doing a lot of entrepreneurial things, even in the nonprofit world, and that those mapped to being an entrepreneur better than I expected. But it's an interesting question. I don't think so. I think I would have probably gotten the bug, and I'd actually take what you said and take it a step further. It is not clear to me why, in today's day and age, why almost everything shouldn't start out as a side hustle.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, I guess there are some things that can't, maybe. But generally, we just live in a world where the technology is so robust that you can have a job that you work 40 hours a week. I mean, like, you just think about a week. A week has whatever, 168 hours. Is that right? 100 164 hours. And, okay, I've got to sleep 50 something of those. So I've got 110 hours to play with. And there's really no obvious reason to me why I can't spend 40 of those working and earning an income, and then I can't have another 40 or 50 to be able to, via technology, start something and prove out the concept and work myself out of a normal job. And that would probably be the advice I'd give to anybody who wants to eventually work for themselves or become entrepreneurial. Is there's really nothing stopping you from doing that today, with where technology is at. And so, um, the it's one of the challenges that I'll see people put out there, which I think is a great one, is like, make $1 on the internet. Go earn
Mm-hmm.
$1 on the internet, because it turns out that actually just taking that very first step is usually the hardest part.
Yeah.
And once you take the first step, so one of the ways I'll put this sometimes is going from 0 to 1 is really difficult, and most people just can't do it. It's not that they're not intellectually capable, it's just too intimidating, and so they can't mentally do it. The number of people that can go 1 to 2 is significantly larger, right? You might have twice as many people. If you're like, okay, we've gotten from 0 to 1, how do we get from 1 to 2? They'd be like, okay, I can figure out how to do this. Getting from like 4 to 5, 80% of the population, 90% of the population can do. So really what you're trying to do is defeat this fear of going 0 to 1 on things.
Yeah.
And technology just makes it easier than ever before to attack that. It's interesting. We had somebody who worked in customer support for our company, and um, she left. She had kids, and she emailed me and said, "Hey, can I come back?" And I said, "Well, we really don't have any positions." And she was like, "Well, I really would love to try something entrepreneurial." And I'm just being honest here. I didn't know if she had what it took, but I was like, "Well," I encouraged her. I was like, "You should try it, and here are some principles, and here's how I would go about it." And I didn't talk to her for a couple of years, and I come to find out, I saw her a couple of weeks ago, and I come to find out that she now runs a really successful food Instagram account. And it's like, man, that's awesome. Like, it's just proof that it really is possible, and the internet has just opened up all these vectors of possibility. But it doesn't have to be like, hey, I push all my chips in, and if this doesn't work in 3 months, then I'm done. Like, a really simple principle is that to be an effective entrepreneur, you just don't get taken out of the game, right? Like,
Mm.
if you keep getting kind of wax at the pinata, eventually you're going to make contact, and you just don't want to get taken out of the game. And so creating a kind of intentionally structuring everything you do where there's not these kill shots that just take you out. And
Right.
the kind of kill shots that take you out is like, I took on a bunch of debt, and if I don't in X number of months or a year get this thing going, then I default on the debt and I'm bankrupt. And it's like, okay, well, that takes you out of the game. Is there's got to be another way to do this. How do you approach this differently? And sometimes, occasionally, there's things that's like, hey, you got to have a lot of capex and you can't do it. But most jobs now, like, it turns out that if you force yourself, if you create kind of like a, hey, I have to be able to get to whatever, $5,000 in revenue a week, and I have to do it without taking on debt or without, keep staying in my day job, that you can find a way to do it. And so, anyway, I think it's how I kind of got into it. But honestly, I think for almost anybody, even really entrepreneurial people, it's not a bad way to approach it. Have a steady income, and then just invest all those outside hours into a side gig and work yourself out of a job. People like you that are really entrepreneurial, I think it's just quicker. They're just able to see it and get it spun up a lot quicker than maybe some other people, where it might take 2 or 3 years for them to catch it.
What was that first business that your brother pulled you into? What did you guys do there?
It
And then what
was
was
an
the next one
auction
that failed?
website. It was an auction website, and the company was really successful. Did about $1 billion in revenue
Wow.
over a 7 or 8 year period. It just kind of a crazy. The whole thing was kind of crazy. In fact, it's funny. Its third year, I think it made about $20 million. That business did in profit. And my brother was like a 80-something% owner, and he didn't know what to do with all of the profit. And he came to me one day in 2012, and he was like, I'm going to buy $1 million of Bitcoin. And so we talked about it. And then in the end, he didn't do it. And I think the reason why I didn't do it, this was a point when to buy that kind of Bitcoin, like it was basically Mt. Gox was the one exchange.
Right.
And so he didn't buy it. And it turns out that $1 million would be like $7 billion if he'd bought it. But it's funny because I'm like, how do you rationalize that? And he's like, well, if I bought it through Mt. Gox, it got hacked and I would have lost it anyway. So I'm like, okay, that's pretty good. But so it was a
How do you
very,
sleep at night? Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Well, here's what's interesting. One of the ways that if you lay out my career and you just kind of say, okay, basically three main stops. First stop, I was in the nonprofit world and ministry, and I think by kind of the ways that you would think about defining quote unquote success there, it was very successful. Then a few years working with my brother, and we started some companies that didn't work, but several of the ones we started did over $1 billion in 7 years of sales. It's like, okay, that's pretty good. That's a pretty good outcome. And then started Simple Modern, and we're in year 9 and we've done about $1 billion in retail sales. So basically like 3 stops. And it's interesting because you could very easily look at that and say, well, you've just kind of lived a charmed life. You've just kind of, everything has worked each step of the way. But what's interesting is that there's an alternative way to tell the story, which I think is actually far more true and interesting and helpful, which is my life has actually been me being tantalizingly close to massive success probably 25 times, and only 2 or 3 of those actually panning out, and the other 90% not, for one reason or another. It's interesting. So you asked about like what was the other
That's a
business idea?
wonderful insight, by the way.
The other business idea was this is like 2011. Um, the App Store is still basically in its infancy, and the insight was we thought that things were going to heavily gamify, which we were right, and we thought what we could do is build an e-commerce website where you could go and buy whatever, but then when you checked out, you get to play a little game and you earned a discount on your cart. And we thought this could be really engaging. So um, we made several major mistakes. But the biggest one and the most obvious one is that we shouldn't have even messed with the e-commerce piece of it. We should have just made games. Like if we had just made mobile games, we would have made like probably like $1 billion, because that was the exact right time. It was interesting. We were looking at a company uh, called King. I don't know if that's what they were called at the time. They may have been called something different before that, but they had just released a game called Candy Crush, and this is back before Candy Crush was a very big thing. And we were like, oh yeah, we think this is where things are going. And so we had. It's interesting because we had all the right insights. We just did the
You're
wrong
on the right
application of it.
platform.
That's right.
You have the right insight. You have the
Well, and it was also
experience. You
interesting because
saw the one that was going to become big.
we did. It's
Yeah.
interesting also because at this point, mobile was not nearly as big. And so a lot of these games like Candy Crush were built originally for desktop, I believe. And so we focused on desktop and we focused on Flash and e-commerce. We should have been focused on native mobile apps and just gaming. And so very close, but miles away, it turned out. And so I guess my whole point in saying that is that you should probably expect to have quite a few of those in your life. And that the people who don't have quite a few, near misses, and have been really successful, I generally attribute that to more luck than anything else. I think it's possible that they're just that smart, but generally what I have found is that it's usually more luck if your hit rate is just amazing. And I could go on and on. Like I had a whole bunch of Bitcoin that I bought in 2014 that I sold when we started Simple Modern to buy inventory. And it's like, well, it's worked out. Okay. But I probably sold several, whatever, $10 million of Bitcoin. Another story I love to tell is when right out of college, I had $30,000, and because I'd gotten a full ride and I'd saved and whatever, and I put it all in one stock, and I held that stock for maybe 6 or 9 months, and it doubled. But then when my wife and I wanted to buy our first house, the only way we could get it is if I put 60% down, because we made so little money because I was in the nonprofit world, and the so I sold all that stock to fund the down payment on my house. And I always tell people it's the most expensive house I ever bought because I sold, $60,000 of Netflix stock in 2003, which is, again, it's like $20 million worth of stock today. But those stories, I think, all they highlight is that I've consistently been in interesting places where there was action, and often I have not executed in a way where I saw the benefit. But I think if you consistently are building interesting things and you're in the kind of the right areas, you really increase the surface area chance of something going well. And that when you do have something that goes really well, I think I've probably been very effective at leaning into that, which is why I've been a part of a couple of really big outcomes.
And the examples you just gave are near misses, right? It's like here's a project that almost was huge, but
Right.
either it didn't succeed for one reason or another, or I pulled out and therefore like I missed a big opportunity. There's also the like millions of moments along the way of something that does succeed, right? I'm sure like the auction house, there were days where something almost blew up. I'm sure with Simple Modern, you guys are so successful today, but there were probably periods along the way where things felt really dark or felt really difficult in a way that you would have never imagined today's
For sure.
outcome. Is that right? Were there
Yeah. Oh,
days and
absolutely.
are there any days in
Absolutely.
Simple Modern
One
that you could kind of share?
one story. This would have been 2017. So we sold our first water bottle in the spring of 2016. By holiday Black Friday period of 2017, we had grown to some pretty good scale on Amazon, and the company is bootstrapped. So we basically like were very hand to mouth. The moment we sold inventory, we'd use all the proceeds to buy more inventory. We had built up a little bit of a bank facility to help fund inventory, and going into the holidays of that year, we had basically just kind of unloaded the clip on inventory to have a great holiday sales period. And uh, Amazon at this point was like 95% of our sales. We woke up on the Monday of Black Friday week and our sales were at zero, which was really weird. And then we noticed that Amazon had a little notification that said our account had been suspended, and we really didn't
No.
have any idea why. Amazon's real interesting how they're better today, but the way that they used to kind of police the seller community is that they would put you on probation if they didn't like something, or they would suspend you, and they would basically say you've done something wrong. You know what you've done. We're not going to tell you what you've done. We're going to have you write us a letter telling us how sorry you are for what you've done and how you fixed it. And if you figure out why we're upset at you and you apologize in a way that we're satisfied with, we're going to turn your account back on. It was
The
not
hard hammer
great.
of the law.
Yeah, and one other thing that's worth kind of noting about Amazon is that the platform is so big that this is all algorithmically driven. So in this case, we really did not know. We just didn't understand, and it set off about a 48-hour period where we were trying to get the account reinstated because basically everybody at Amazon was going to go on, you know, go home for Thanksgiving on Wednesday, and if we didn't get the account turned back on, we were just going to miss Black Friday, Cyber Monday,
Oh man.
which is, I mean, I think it was existentially.
It's like
Uh,
50% of sales for some companies.
yeah, I mean, the reason why they call it Black Friday, a lot of people don't know this, is that for many retailers, it's where you go from being in the red for the year to in the black because you do so many sales and you generate so much profit. So it was about 48 hours of trying to get the account reinstated and not sure if we were going to. That was extremely scary. And
How did you feel in the moment? I can't even imagine that being all in and having this like big entity that won't tell me what I did wrong or how long it's going to take to get fixed.
well, it's a great example of how managing yourself is so much of being successful. It's interesting because early on, I was telling the team like, we're gonna get it fixed. Like I'm not concerned. Um,
Yeah,
I
you
was
got to
saying
be
all the
cool, right? You're the
yeah, yeah,
CEO. We
yeah, I was
got
saying all
this.
the right things, and um, that lasted all the way up until Tuesday evening, and then I started to be like, I don't think we're going to get this fixed. And there's a great company culture story where there were basically two of the people of our maybe 15-person team at that point that really understood how to work within Amazon and its catalog. And we had kind of a last ditch effort. We were going to try. We were going to try and basically rebuild the entire catalog on Tuesday night. And so everybody goes home, and me and the other person who can work on this, who was in New York, he was supposed to be on vacation. He was supposed to be going to Hamilton with the original cast. He cancels to basically sit and try and fix this with
Oh,
me. And we start working on it, and it becomes obvious really clearly, like that, there's so much work. I don't even know that we can get through it if we pull an all-nighter. Um, and we didn't ask anybody else to help because we didn't think anybody else could, but kind of organically, the team on Slack starts kind of pinging us, hey, is there any way we can help? Is there any way we can help? And uh, so it's like, well, actually, if you could do this one thing over here, if you could prepare this CSV over there. And so over like a 2 or 3 hour period, everybody organically on their own kind of accord had shown up and kind of said, hey, how can I help? And it turned into the entire team working basically through the night. And we got the account reinstated at something like 3 in the morning, and we
wow.
ended up having a great holiday. But it was a very scary period, and made me realize how even though the business had grown a lot, it was still very fragile. We had to diversify sales channels. And we've had maybe one or two other. I mean, COVID was one of those periods where I think anybody who had a business during COVID, there was a moment or a couple months where it was like, are we going to be okay? I'm not sure if we're going to be okay. Um, so it's in those moments, I think leadership really matters. And you're really trying to strike the balance of saying, we are going to get through this. I don't know how necessarily, but we're going to get through this. But also, this is a really serious issue that people need to hear you saying both of those things, not taking it lightly, and being overly stoic, and not freaking out and losing your head, because that will definitely cause people to get to emotionally hyperventilate. And so, hey, it's serious. We have got to do something here. We have got to fix this, but we are going to figure it out, and we are going to get to the other side. That's the kind of leadership people typically need in those situations.
I imagine a shock like that, and then COVID as well, in some ways is horrible, right? Like your business maybe could have ended, or could have been a very different outcome for the ensuing year or two. Um, and in some ways, like it feels like it could be very unifying and clarifying, and also maybe exposes some of the weaknesses in the system or the
Yeah.
process. Like you just called out that, hey, okay, maybe we got to diversify. Does that feel right to you?
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly it. That it's kind of goes back to what I was saying earlier with parenting. Like, it actually turns out to build strong adults, what you need them to be in really challenging and stressful situations. They need to endure failure, and our businesses are the same. That if you think about it, if your business never feels challenged, right? It never feels like, oh, we could be in danger of competition, we could be in danger of bankruptcy, whatever. Like, eventually your people are just going to feel like it's easy. Eventually people are just going to feel like, yeah, we just show up and we print money and that's what we do here. And they're going to think that right up until they get disrupted, you know? So, um, good leadership, I think, creates situations where people understand. You simultaneously want to create the urgency and the understanding that the market's really competitive, and it's there's a lot of people who would love to come and take the profits that you have, but also the confidence that if you give your best effort, that things are going to be okay. And so, like, we've rolled out a bunch of programs for our employees. We're an ESOP, which means every employee gains ownership in the company every year. We just rolled
Yeah,
out.
you guys do some really incredible things for your employees. I've looked
Yeah,
into this a little bit. You
we've
guys,
leaned in pretty heavily. Yeah, we just announced a $500 per month employee childcare
wow.
credit. Um, and if you're making whatever, if you're making $50,000 a year, and you get $20,000 worth of stock ownership a year, and or 10,000 or whatever, and then you get another $6,000 in childcare reimbursement. I mean, it's like this stuff matters. It adds up. And the thing that I say every time we announce one of these initiatives is, listen, like for us to do this, we have to continue to win. Like all of these benefits, the only reason why they're possible is because we're winning. And so it's a joy. It's a joy to share the success of the company with all the people that built it and made it possible. But also, if at any point we take this for granted, then it'll go away, because there are, the market is full of people that would love to come and take what we have. And we have to keep that competitive spirit and that edge. And so hopefully that's what the team has taken away from it, is that there's an ownership group at this company. And I guess really everybody's an owner now, but like there's a mentality of, we are truly going to be generous and share the winnings with everybody. But for there to be winnings, we have to go hard. And I think what you're really trying to create in your company is an environment where people kind of manage and challenge themselves. So I am a pretty driven person. I really will get after it. But one of my favorite things about the company is I don't really feel like I have to motivate people to get after it, because everybody in the company is going to be harder on themselves and is going to be more internally driven than anything I could do. And I love that. I think that's been a massive part of our success, that is true. So this goes back to the internal, external, intrinsic, extrinsic motivation. You really want people that are intrinsically motivated, that they want to come and just absolutely do the best job they can at work, not because they want to impress their boss, not because they want to buy a new Hummer, but just because it will drive them crazy if they're not doing the absolute best they can.
Yeah.
And so if you can hire a bunch of those type of people, it creates a really special environment where you're not having to manage or motivate people very much. And I think our team has a lot of that.
Yeah, I heard a quote from Mike Moritz from Sequoia once, years, maybe 25 years after they'd been in business. Sequoia is like the big venture capital firm,
Mm-hmm.
and they're the name, right? They're
Right.
the big dog of dogs, basically. And I remember maybe like 5 to 10 years ago, I heard a quote that said something like, if we're not constantly on our toes and looking around
Mm-hmm.
the corner, we will fade into irrelevance.
Mm-hmm.
Was kind of the nature of the quote. I'm sure I butchered it. And it was so interesting to see because, like, I get it from a startup, or I get it from somebody who's been in business for 10 years. But this is Sequoia, like they invested in Google, they invested in LinkedIn, they've invested in all of the biggest tech companies in the world. You'd think that at that stage, the partners are comfortable. They feel like they got it. They built the brand. They're not going anywhere. But that communication is obviously something that's like intrinsic to their culture and something that they push to all of their staff. You got to stay on your toes. You got to keep pushing, because the only way that we maintain this brand is if we continue winning, which makes me think of what you're building
Yeah.
in some ways.
I think it's a general truism about life that I think the moment you start to coast, the moment you start to shut it down, um, it goes poorly. And that's it. Just even in retirement, like you're like, I'm going to retire, or I'm going to sit on the beach, and it's like you're just likely to decline mentally,
Yeah.
health wise, like because you're not challenging yourself. That we do best when we're challenging ourselves. This is true of our body. Our body does best when we're physically challenging it a certain amount every week with exercise, mentally challenging it a certain amount every week. And so you just really want to build a culture where the motivation for that challenge doesn't have to be, oh, our sales are down, or oh, such and such competitor did this thing, we've got to respond. But instead the motivation is just like, what else would I do? I would be so bored if I couldn't come in and challenge myself this week. And I think that's especially important because in the most successful companies, I mean, Sequoia is a great example of this. In the most successful companies, they are so successful that if you're not getting intrinsic challenge, then you're likely not to feel any challenge at all. Sequoia can just kind of show up with their name and probably you know, get into the rounds that they want to get into for the next 10 or 15 years just because of the name.
Mm-hmm.
But the people in Sequoia would be deeply unsatisfied and unhappy if that's what they were doing. And so yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think birds of a feather flock together, and that really A players, it just drives them crazy being with B and C. Anybody
That's so
below a
true.
B player, it just drives them crazy. They'll just leave. Is kind
Right.
of the thing that I've learned. And so people talk all the time about hiring A players, but it's like the key to hiring A players, I think, is as much as anything else, it's creating a culture that's an A player culture and filling it with A players, because people that have that kind of drive and this kind of mindset that we're talking about, they just simply won't tolerate being around others. They'll just go somewhere else.
And you
So
have to be careful, right? You have to remove kind of the B and C players along the way as well, because you're not
yeah,
going to hire perfectly. You got to protect your nucleus.
and sometimes I think there's a difference between mindset and ability. Sometimes you'll have somebody with the right mindset but not great ability, and they're not really repulsive to A players. It's Sometimes you have people with a good amount of ability but the wrong mindset. They are very repulsive to, like, a simple way of saying this is A players don't think about optics. They're not concerned with optics. They're concerned with outcomes.
Hmm.
And people that are optic driven will drive them crazy.
Yeah.
Like, oh, you're probably right that would be more effective, but how would it look? I mean, like that'll just drive an A player crazy. It's like, what are you talking about?
Right.
And to some extent, to draw a political analogy, um, I think that some of why this election went this way is that the Democratic Party started to become a party where it really felt like the optics mattered more than the outcomes, and that's been largely rejected even by people that the programs were supposedly, that they were supposedly helping. So that might be another just kind of litmus test is
Yeah.
in
And
your
if you look at the
culture.
other direction, the reason that Elon and maybe Trump are successful is because they don't care about optics, right?
Yeah, they're kind of the extreme outcome, the extreme
Right.
other side, which there's certainly a balance where it's like, yeah, we care about outcomes, but like we want to do it in the right way. But I do think at the end of the day, people, you want to build a culture where outcomes are king, and not the kind of who gets the credit or how does it look. That stuff will drive you crazy. I don't know if you've seen this before, but there's a great thing that'll make it the rounds on Twitter every so often. It's something I want to say the KGB put together that was basically like how to sabotage any organization.
Is it a
And
video? It's like an interview with a KGB
there's
agent.
yeah, there's different forms of it, but I mean, like, it's a bunch of stuff like this. It's like never allow decisions to be fully made, constantly reopen previously made decisions, constantly talk about optics over outcomes. There's a list of like 30 of them, of just like, here's how you just can totally neuter an organization without obviously trying to sabotage it, which is really interesting.
Fascinating.
So I'm a big believer in culture. I think that's probably the main kind of thing I would emphasize from this whole section of the conversation is that culture matters a tremendous amount. And one of the things that I've learned about culture that maybe caught me a little bit off guard when we were small, I wanted to keep the company really small because I thought there's really no way to scale culture the way that I would want to. I think as you get more and more people in a thing, the culture is going to become more and more of a reflection on just like the surrounding kind of culture. And Oklahoma's fine, but I wasn't aiming for Oklahoma culture. I was aiming for a very particular type of culture. And what I did not understand then, but I understand now, is that usually that's what happens. And I think this is what happens in most like Fortune 500 companies, big companies, is like that the culture, it's just very difficult to maintain culture. It just becomes kind of an average of, I mean, you think about Amazon, they've got 2 million employees. It's like, it's very difficult to keep, a high performing culture when you have that many people. But what I've learned in the last few years is that The exception to that rule is when you have everyone take personal ownership for the culture, then it actually can go the other way and culture can get stronger the more people you have. But
Mm,
that's the key, is that people have to own it. They can't be passively engaged in the culture. They have to be like, no, this is the culture we have, and I am a big part of why it's that way. And so when I get together with every new hire, and we do walk through our values and our mission. And one of the things I end the time with is basically like, the culture is like a garden. For it to thrive, everyone has to pick the weeds, everyone has to fertilize the plants, everyone has to water the soil. And for you to experience the type of culture that you want here, you are going to have to own it with me. I know it's
right.
your first week, but I need to be able to give you the baton, and I need you to lead. The way it's going to look for you to lead in culture versus me or somebody else is going to be different. You've got to kind of find what is your particular way to contribute and lead across our values and our mission. But I need you to lead with me.
Yeah,
I'm now less than 1% of the hours that get worked in the organization. And so, um, in some ways, I have a disproportional kind of influence because I'm founder, CEO, but still, like, the culture is going to be defined by people other than me because I'm just such a small percentage of what's
I
going
love
on
that.
here.
I you actually used to tell employees when they joined, you need to contribute to the culture every day because you may wake up 5 years from now as part of a company that you're unhappy and you're
Yeah.
unhappy with the culture. And the only reason that happens is because you didn't contribute. So,
Yep.
if you want to wake up happy every day, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, 10 years from now, content with the people that you're surrounded by and the culture that you work in, you have to contribute every single day.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And if you can do that, if you can get people to really buy in and view themselves as guardians and owners of the culture, then the more people you add, the easier it gets. This is a really simple litmus test, but it's an interesting one. Um, I would hope to build a culture so strong that if I was not willing to follow it, that the company would reject me.
Wow,
That the,
that's an incredible
and
test and a
nobody.
very difficult test.
Yeah, and it's a difficult one because
Yeah,
typically we think about I mean, we think about, if I start a business, it's my business. I own
right.
it. It belongs to me. It's here to serve me. But that's actually kind of an idea that's counter to the idea of culture. Culture is about, hey, these ideals, this mission transcends all of us. It's bigger than all of us, and no one is above it. And that's what you're really trying to communicate. Like, we're about growth mindset here. Well, you know what? I'm not above that. We're about excellence here. I'm not above that. We're about generosity here. I'm not above that. And that, for me to be the most effective leader is actually that I'm really leading in displaying those attributes in my life. But if at some point I was unwilling to do that, then I would hope people would say, hey, you say you're about these things, you say the company's about these things, you're not really about these things. We want to follow somebody else. We You don't have the kind of moral and cultural authority to lead. And so, anyway, it's
You
just a
heard it here from the
challenging
boss.
thought.
If Mike steps out of line for too long, you can oust him, but give him grace, give him a couple warnings so he can work
Sure.
his way back to the value center.
Well, you just can't create a good for thee, not for me kind of situation. You
Yeah,
know, like, the best leaders are ones that there's a documentary about Jordan and the Bulls, The Last Dance, and it has a
I
really
cried during
interesting,
that documentary. I'm such a
yeah,
sucker for
like
those.
the part at the end of one of the episodes, the really famous part where it's like, you know, was I? They're like, they ask him, "Were you a nice guy?" And he's like, "Was I a nice guy? No, not really." He was like, leadership has a cost, it has a price, and sometimes I push people that didn't want to be pushed. But then one of the things he says, which I think is really, it's really accurate, he's like, one thing that people will tell you about Michael Jordan is he never effing asked them to do something he wasn't willing to do himself.
Yeah,
And I think that is what leadership
service
is.
leadership. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, you can't ever ask anybody to do something that you're not personally willing to do yourself. And so that definitely applies in values and mission and all the stuff we're talking about.
I want to wrap on this question. I've looked up to a lot of people in my life, and people helped me along the way. I'm curious, who are some mentors or idols that you look up to in your life?
So generally, I have the attitude I can learn from anybody, which I think is helpful. And one thing that's probably unique about me is that I don't tend to, I try to not idolize certain people, because, in our culture, we have this kind of, oh, the richest people or the people who've had the most extreme outcomes. Um, I've kind of got more of a very long list of, I could probably give you 1,000 names of people that I've learned something from.
Mm,
I have become much more of a biography reader, because, and it's been interesting. In every biography I read, there are things that I admire and things that I would, I take away from that I wouldn't do from people's lives. And I think it's an incredibly helpful. It's really amazing if you think about it. A book is this flat object. Carl Sagan talked about this. It's this flat object that when you open it, it's like you can mind meld with someone across time, across cultures, and it's like they can speak directly into your mind. And the idea, it's almost like, in the Matrix, when that movie came out, this idea that like you could just download, I know kung fu, like you could just download information into your brain. And biographies are like this amazing ability to download an entire person's life and experiences and to learn from them. And it's just like, man, that is just phenomenal. So there's people, I mean, I'm a Christian, so there's people in the Bible, there's Christians that have lived throughout history that are, I think, deeply influential in the way that I think about things. I mean, the ending of the transatlantic slave trade was largely driven by Christians. There have been a lot of Christians that have worked in the business world, and the way that they have thought about the ability to use business and in a missional way and a redemptive way that's been really influential. I mean, I think there are a lot of people that you wouldn't even know their names, but the way that they treat others, the character they have, deeply admire in my personal life. One of the things that's really unique about Simple Modern is if you look at our senior leadership team, I think I have somewhere between 200 and 300 years worth of relational connection with that team. And so I work with all these people that I've known for 10 to 30 years, basically. And each of them is somebody that I draw a ton of learning and inspiration from. Um, there's business leaders in this community that are now in their 70s and 80s, and I've watched how they've built companies, and it's been really inspirational, and it's been a blueprint. I'm not trying to build the same thing as them, but it's been really inspirational. There's some philanthropists I look at that I'm like, man, it's amazing to see the way that you've given towards things. So I would say there's just, it's a very broad set, and having the kind of mindset that I can learn from anyone is helpful, partially because people are inherently flawed. And the idea that idolizing any one person is dangerous because we all have big blind spots. We all have glaring weaknesses. And so just the opportunity that we have with technology and with the amount of information that's out there to learn from the lives of hundreds or thousands of people is just fascinating. Like so random. I read a book about Hannibal a month or two ago, and I learned a ton about reading about Hannibal and the Carthaginian Wars, and it helped me to think differently about some aspects of my life. And it's like that is kind of random, but I also think it's kind of the point that what we have that most other people that have lived throughout human civilization did not have is we have access. We have access to just so much. So in some ways, to me, it's always like if your answer to that is, Elon Musk or Barack Obama or whatever, it's kind of like dig deeper, right? There's a lot
Yeah.
of fantastic, just phenomenal people that have lived over history, and that there's a little bit of this kind of recency bias also, I think, of like we tend to look at people in our current culture, and most of the remarkable people that have lived over the course of time aren't living today. You know, there are people that have come in the past. So anyway, very long answer to say that it's a long list.
No, I think that's a fascinating answer, and actually reminds me my early 20s. I was building my first startup, and I was, kind of a snot-nosed youth. And I was really excited about hanging out with entrepreneurs, people who'd built things. And I was a little bit kind of like dismissive of people that were not doing that,
Yeah.
not actively, but in the middle of a conversation, I couldn't really find things to connect on. And then I heard an interview with the founder of WordPress, Matt Mullenweg, and
Mm-hmm.
he just briefly mentioned this comment. He said, I try to be curious and learn something in every conversation that I have, no matter who I'm talking to. And he said, if you are in a conversation and you find the other person too boring to talk to, it's because you are too boring. And it just hit me like a truck. I
That's a
was like,
great
oh,
quote.
wow. Like, I'm standing here. I'm not like, here's like a person who's in front of me who's been alive for 45 years, who has a family, who has a background, who has a career. And I'm standing here unable to have like an interesting conversation or learn something from them. That squarely falls on me. And it actually, here a decade or so later, it still comes up in my head all the time in the middle of a conversation.
Yeah,
So,
it's really like a growth mindset principle. The guy, the founder of Twitch, who was briefly came in when Altman got ousted from OpenAI to kind of help right the ship there. He had a tweet recently that's like anytime.
Emmett, is that who that is?
Yeah, yeah, and
Yeah.
and he was like anytime I'm working on something and I'm frustrated by it, or it's not going the way that I want to, I just say to myself, skill issue.
Yeah.
And I just thought, man, that's really insightful. It's like if you're in a conversation that's frustrating to you or you don't feel like you're getting anything out of it, it's like skill issue. You're not asking good enough questions. You're not, like you're not engaging in a way to be able to make that a conversation. And I definitely agree with the idea that um, humility and our own kind of pride and hubris, these are things that can really stand in the way of learning, right? That the idea of I'm above learning from certain people or whatever, or like this person's not interesting enough. It is interesting that some of the more profound things I think I've learned about business I did not learn from business people.
Hmm.
you know
Yeah.
so anyway, great point. I love it.
I have one book that, if you haven't read it, I think you might enjoy. It's by Robert Caro. It's The Power Broker. Have you
Okay,
heard of this book?
I've heard of it, but I have
Robert
not read it.
Robert Moses and the Fall of New York. It's a massive book about the biography of an urban planner in New York well, he was actually an urban planner throughout 4 or 5 mayors in New York, but LaGuardia, there's an airport in New York named LaGuardia. So, who was a famous mayor, and partially the reason that he was famous is because this guy Robert Moses was behind him. So he was kind of like the string puller of the early 1900s in New York. It's a fascinating, fascinating book. I highly recommend it,
Yeah,
for you to
I'm
check
in.
out.
I will.
Yeah.
I will download it today.
Mike, this has been wonderful. I really appreciate you taking the time. What's a good place for people to kind of get in touch with you, or at least follow what you're doing?
Yeah, so our company is Simple Modern. We sell basically everywhere. Probably have some drinkware that you would love. In terms of following me, you can follow me on Twitter at Mike Beckham SM, and also on LinkedIn.
Awesome. Well, Mike, thanks for the time. Thanks for the knowledge. I appreciate it. This was great.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.